The death penalty, a topic of intense debate and controversy, varies significantly across the globe.
The recent poll that the government do, there's a discussion about the pros and cons of the death penalty.
From the methods employed to the crimes punishable, the application of capital punishment is shaped by a complex interplay of cultural, political, and religious factors. This video explores the stark differences in how 15 countries approach the ultimate punishment. A grim spectrum. The methods used to carry out the death penalty are as diverse as they are grim. In Yemen, public executions by stoning are employed, particularly targeting individuals for apostasy and homosexuality due to strict interpretations of Islamic law. Saudi Arabia, another country guided by a strict interpretation of Islamic law, primarily executes individuals through public beheading. In contrast, the United States employs lethal injection as the primary execution method, with some states exploring alternatives like nitrogen hypoxia. Japan takes a more secretive approach, where prisoners can be executed without warning, and the date is not disclosed until after the execution has taken place. China, known for the highest number of executions worldwide, and Vietnam, which also uses capital punishment for economic crimes, both employ lethal injection and firing squads. Indonesia, particularly when dealing with drug traffickers, typically carries out executions by firing squad. Belarus, the only European country that still actively uses the death penalty, applies it through firing squads for crimes such as high treason. Botswana, one of the few African countries that still actively enforces the death penalty, primarily for murder, conducts executions by hanging, as does India, which employs the death penalty for particularly heinous crimes. The secrecy surrounding executions. In several countries, the process surrounding executions is shrouded in secrecy, adding an additional layer of complexity and controversy to the already contentious issue of capital punishment. China, for example, is known for its highly secretive approach to the death penalty. The country carries out the highest number of executions worldwide, yet the exact figures remain a state secret. Executions are often carried out shortly after sentencing, with little to no transparency regarding the proceedings. Similarly, Japan maintains a high level of secrecy surrounding its capital punishment system. Prisoners are typically executed without warning, and the date of execution is not disclosed until after the fact. This practice has been criticized by human rights organizations, arguing that it causes undue psychological distress for the prisoners and their families. North Korea, an extremely secretive regime, is believed to use public executions as a means to instill fear and suppress dissent among its population. However, due to the country's isolation and lack of transparency, it is challenging to verify the extent and nature of these executions. The secrecy surrounding executions in these countries raises significant concerns about the fairness and transparency of the judicial process. It also hinders efforts to monitor and advocate for human rights, as the lack of information makes it difficult to assess the situation accurately. As the international community continues to grapple with the issue of capital punishment, the need for greater transparency and accountability in the application of the death penalty remains a pressing concern. Crimes punishable by death, a global perspective. The crimes punishable by death vary significantly across different countries, reflecting diverse cultural, religious, and political values. In Yemen and Saudi Arabia, where strict interpretations of Islamic law are enforced, apostasy and homosexuality can be met with the death penalty. These countries also apply capital punishment for crimes such as murder, drug trafficking, armed robbery, and rape. In China, the death penalty covers a wide range of crimes, including non-violent offenses like economic crimes and drug-related offenses. This broad application of capital punishment has drawn international criticism, with concerns raised about the proportionality of the punishment to the crime committed. The United States, while retaining the death penalty at the federal level and in several states, generally restricts its application to aggravated murder cases. However, the country has faced criticism for its inconsistent application of the death penalty across different jurisdictions and the disproportionate impact on marginalized communities. In Singapore, drug trafficking and murder can carry a mandatory death sentence, reflecting the country's strict approach to law enforcement. Indonesia has also garnered international attention for imposing the death penalty on drug traffickers, particularly foreign nationals, leading to diplomatic tensions with the offenders' home countries. India and Botswana apply the death penalty primarily for murder and other heinous crimes, while Belarus, the only European country that still actively uses capital punishment, applies it for crimes such as high treason. The varied application of the death penalty for different crimes across the globe underscores the ongoing debate about the effectiveness, fairness, and morality of capital punishment. As international norms shift towards the abolition of the death penalty, countries that continue to impose it for a wide range of offenses face increasing scrutiny and pressure to reform their criminal justice systems. Public executions. Fear, deterrence, and controversy. Public executions, while less common in the modern era, are still practiced in some countries as a means of deterrence, punishment, and sometimes as a tool for political control. However, the practice remains highly controversial, with critics arguing that it violates human dignity and has little deterrent effect on crime. In Yemen, public executions by stoning are carried out, particularly targeting individuals for apostasy and homosexuality. These executions, often justified by strict interpretations of Islamic law, are meant to serve as a warning to others who might consider deviating from religious and social norms. Similarly, Saudi Arabia conducts public beheadings, drawing large crowds and generating significant international condemnation. Iran, another country that frequently employs the death penalty, often conducts public hangings. These executions, sometimes involving political dissidents and juveniles, are intended to instill fear and compliance among the population. The public nature of these executions has been criticized as a violation of international human rights standards, which call for executions to be carried out with a minimum of suffering and away from public view. North Korea, an authoritarian regime known for its secrecy and human rights abuses, allegedly uses public executions to suppress dissent and maintain control over its citizens. Although information is limited due to the country's isolation, reports suggest that executions are carried out for a wide range of offenses, including minor crimes like petty theft and watching foreign media. Proponents of public executions argue that they serve as a powerful deterrent against crime, sending a clear message to would-be offenders about the consequences of their actions. However, research on the deterrent effect of capital punishment, both public and private, remains inconclusive. Many experts argue that factors such as the certainty of punishment and effective law enforcement have a more significant impact on crime rates than the severity of the punishment itself. Moreover, the spectacle of public executions has been criticized for desensitizing the public to violence and for reinforcing a culture of retribution rather than rehabilitation. The practice also raises concerns about the potential for public disorder and the psychological impact on those who witness the executions, particularly children. The death penalty and human rights concerns. The application of the death penalty raises significant human rights concerns, with international organizations and activists calling for its abolition worldwide. These concerns range from the inherent cruelty of the punishment to the risk of wrongful convictions and the disproportionate impact on marginalized communities. One of the primary arguments against the death penalty is that it violates the right to life, which is enshrined in international human rights treaties, such as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Critics argue that the intentional taking of human life by the state is fundamentally incompatible with the principles of human dignity and the value of human life. Moreover, the methods used to carry out executions, such as lethal injection, hanging, and firing squads, have been criticized as cruel, inhuman, and degrading. The secrecy surrounding execution protocols in some countries, such as the United States and Japan, has also raised concerns about the potential for botched executions and unnecessary suffering. Another major human rights concern is the risk of wrongful convictions and the irreversible nature of the death penalty. Despite advances in forensic science and legal safeguards, the risk of executing an innocent person remains a grave concern. In countries with flawed criminal justice systems, the lack of access to adequate legal representation and the use of coerced confessions further increase the likelihood of wrongful convictions. The death penalty also disproportionately impacts marginalized communities, particularly racial and ethnic minorities, the poor, and individuals with intellectual disabilities. In the United States, for example, studies have shown that the race of the victim and the defendant plays a significant role in determining who receives a death sentence. This disparate impact raises concerns about the fairness and non-discrimination in the application of capital punishment. International human rights bodies, such as the United Nations Human Rights Committee and the European Court of Human Rights, have consistently called for the abolition of the death penalty, arguing that it is incompatible with fundamental human rights principles. Many countries have heeded these calls, with a growing number of nations abolishing capital punishment in law or practice. However, countries that continue to apply the death penalty, such as China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen, face ongoing criticism from the international community for their human rights records. The use of the death penalty in these countries is often seen as a reflection of broader issues, such as the lack of political freedoms, the suppression of dissent, and the absence of an independent judiciary. Geopolitical tensions and capital punishment. The use of capital punishment can sometimes strain diplomatic relations between countries, particularly when foreign nationals are sentenced to death. These geopolitical tensions can arise from differences in legal systems, cultural values, and human rights standards. One notable example is Indonesia's execution of foreign drug traffickers, which has led to diplomatic tensions with the offenders' home countries. In 2015, Indonesia executed 8 individuals, including 7 foreign nationals, for drug-related offenses, despite pleas for clemency from their respective governments. This incident strained Indonesia's relations with countries such as Australia, Brazil, and the Netherlands, which strongly oppose the death penalty. Similarly, China's use of the death penalty for a wide range of crimes, including economic offenses, has drawn international criticism and strained its diplomatic relations. Many countries have expressed concern over the lack of transparency in China's criminal justice system and the potential for wrongful convictions. The execution of foreign nationals in China has also led to diplomatic tensions, with some countries attempting to intervene on behalf of their citizens. The case of Saudi Arabia's execution of Jamal Khashoggi, a journalist and critic of the Saudi government, in 2018 also highlighted the geopolitical implications of capital punishment. The murder, which took place inside the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey, sparked a global outcry and led to a deterioration in Saudi Arabia's relations with many Western countries. The incident raised questions about the use of the death penalty as a tool for silencing political dissent and the international community's response to such actions. Geopolitical tensions can also arise when countries with different stances on the death penalty cooperate on criminal justice matters. For example, the European Union, which strongly opposes capital punishment, has faced criticism for its cooperation with countries that still employ the death penalty, such as the United States. This has led to debates about the extent to which countries should prioritize their opposition to the death penalty in their diplomatic relations. The role of religion in shaping death penalty. Laws. Religion has played a significant role in shaping attitudes and laws regarding the death penalty throughout history. Many religious texts, including the Bible and the Quran, contain passages that have been interpreted as justifying capital punishment for certain offenses. However, religious views on the death penalty are diverse and have evolved over time. In countries with a strong Islamic influence, such as Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, the death penalty is often justified by reference to Sharia law. Under strict interpretations of Islamic law, crimes such as apostasy, blasphemy, and homosexuality may be punishable by death. These countries also apply the death penalty for other offenses, such as murder, drug trafficking, and adultery, based on their understanding of religious principles. However, it is important to note that there is no single Islamic view on the death penalty. Some Islamic scholars and religious leaders have argued against the use of capital punishment, emphasizing principles of mercy, forgiveness, and the sanctity of human life. They point to passages in the Quran that encourage forgiveness and suggest that the death penalty should be used only in the most extreme cases, if at all. In the United States, where Christianity is the dominant religion, religious views on the death penalty are divided. Some conservative Christian groups, particularly those adhering to a literal interpretation of the Bible, support the use of capital punishment based on passages such as an eye for an eye. They argue that the death penalty is a just punishment for heinous crimes and that it serves as a deterrent to future offenders. On the other hand, many Christian denominations, including the Catholic Church and some mainline Protestant churches, have taken a strong stance against the death penalty. They emphasize the principles of redemption, forgiveness, and the sanctity of human life, arguing that the death penalty is incompatible with Christian values. These groups have advocated for the abolition of capital punishment and have worked to support death row inmates and their families. Other religious traditions, such as Buddhism and Hinduism, generally oppose the use of the death penalty. These traditions emphasize the principles of nonviolence, compassion, and the belief in the potential for spiritual transformation. They argue that taking a life, even as punishment for a crime, is contrary to these core religious values. Demographic disparities in death penalty application. The application of the death penalty is not only shaped by religious and cultural factors, but also by demographic disparities that raise concerns about fairness and equal treatment under the law. In many countries, the death penalty disproportionately impacts marginalized communities, particularly racial and ethnic minorities, the poor, and individuals with intellectual disabilities. In the United States, for example, numerous studies have shown that the race of both the victim and the defendant plays a significant role in determining who receives a death sentence. African American defendants are more likely to be sentenced to death, especially when the victim is white. This racial disparity persists even when controlling for other factors such as the severity of the crime and the defendant's prior criminal record. Socioeconomic status is another factor that can influence the application of the death penalty. Defendants from poor and marginalized communities often lack access to adequate legal representation, which can have a significant impact on the outcome of their cases. In many countries, including the United States, public defenders are often overworked and underfunded, making it difficult for them to provide effective representation in capital cases. Individuals with intellectual disabilities are also at a higher risk of being sentenced to death. In the United States, the Supreme Court has ruled that executing individuals with intellectual disabilities violates the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. However, determining intellectual disability can be a complex and controversial process, and some states have been criticized for using outdated and unscientific methods to assess defendants' mental capacities. Gender disparities in the application of the death penalty are also evident in some countries. In Iran, for example, women who are convicted of adultery can be sentenced to death by stoning, a punishment that is not applied to men. In Yemen, where homosexuality can be punishable by death, the law is more likely to be enforced against men than women. The demographic disparities in the application of the death penalty raise serious concerns about the fairness and impartiality of the criminal justice system. They suggest that factors such as race, socioeconomic status, and gender can influence the outcome of capital cases, rather than the severity of the crime or the individual's culpability. Efforts to address these disparities have included legal challenges, legislative reforms, and advocacy campaigns aimed at raising awareness about the unequal application of the death penalty. Some countries, such as South Africa and Kazakhstan, have abolished the death penalty in part due to concerns about its disproportionate impact on marginalized communities. The future of the death penalty, trends and developments. As the global debate over the death penalty continues, several trends and developments suggest that the use of capital punishment is declining worldwide. In recent years, a growing number of countries have abolished the death penalty, while others have imposed moratoriums on executions or limited its use to only the most serious crimes. One notable trend is the increasing recognition of the death penalty as a human rights issue. International human rights organizations such as Amnesty International and the United Nations have consistently called for the abolition of capital punishment, arguing that it violates the right to life and the prohibition of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. This shift in perspective has led to increased pressure on countries that still retain the death penalty to reform their criminal justice systems. Another trend is the growing awareness of the risks of wrongful convictions in capital cases. With the advent of DNA testing and other advances in forensic science, there have been numerous cases of individuals being exonerated after spending years or even decades on death row. These cases have highlighted the irreversible nature of the death penalty and the need for greater safeguards to prevent wrongful convictions. In the United States, which has long been one of the leading proponents of the death penalty, public support for capital punishment has been declining in recent years. Several states, including Colorado, New Hampshire, and Washington, have recently abolished the death penalty, while others have imposed moratoriums on executions. This shift in public opinion has been attributed to a range of factors, including concerns about the cost of the death penalty, its disproportionate impact on marginalized communities, and the risk of wrongful convictions. Internationally, the trend towards abolition of the death penalty has been even more pronounced. In the past decade, several countries, including Burkina Faso, Gabon, and Kazakhstan, have abolished the death penalty for all crimes. Others, such as Malaysia and Zimbabwe, have announced plans to abolish capital punishment in the near future. Even in countries that retain the death penalty, such as China and Iran, there have been some efforts to limit its use and increase transparency around the process. However, despite these trends, the death penalty remains entrenched in several countries, particularly those with authoritarian governments or strong religious influences. In these contexts, the use of the death penalty is often seen as a tool for maintaining social order and political control, rather than a matter of criminal justice. Alternatives to the death penalty. Life imprisonment and restorative justice. As the debate over the death penalty continues, many countries and advocates are exploring alternatives to capital punishment that prioritize public safety, justice for victims, and the potential for offender rehabilitation. Two of the most prominent alternatives are life imprisonment and restorative justice. Life imprisonment, also known as life without parole or whole life sentencing, involves sentencing an offender to spend the remainder of their life in prison, with no possibility of release. This approach is often seen as a more humane alternative to the death penalty, as it allows for the possibility of redemption and personal growth, while still ensuring that dangerous offenders are removed from society. However, life imprisonment is not without its critics. Some argue that it is a form of death by incarceration, and that the prolonged isolation and hopelessness of life in prison can be psychologically devastating. Others point out that life sentences are often applied disproportionately to marginalized communities, and that the high costs of incarceration place a significant burden on society. Restorative justice, on the other hand, focuses on repairing the harm caused by crime and promoting healing for both victims and offenders. This approach emphasizes dialogue, accountability, and community involvement, rather than punishment for its own sake. Restorative justice practices, such as victim-offender mediation and community conferencing, aim to give victims a voice in the justice process and allow offenders to take responsibility for their actions and make amends. Proponents of restorative justice argue that it can lead to lower recidivism rates, increased victim satisfaction, and stronger communities. By focusing on the underlying causes of crime and the needs of all parties involved, restorative justice seeks to create a more holistic and effective approach to criminal justice. However, restorative justice is not always appropriate or possible in all cases, particularly those involving the most serious crimes. Some victims may not want to participate in restorative processes, and some offenders may not be willing or able to take responsibility for their actions. In these cases, more traditional forms of punishment, such as imprisonment, may still be necessary.